Joyce McKenny is one of those names that for people of a certain age opens a doorway into the past. To bring her up in conversation is to be transported back to the British 70s, when there was only 3 TV channels, food was not so good, sex was naughty, and Fleet Street was still the home of national newspapers. Although many British industries were in decline in the 70s, the newspaper business was thriving, especially at the tabloid end of the market. The biggest daily paper was the Daily Mirror, followed closely by the Sun with its page 3 stunners. Many a tabloid story was printed, and in 1977 one story would stand out among the rest. It was a bizarre and compelling tale of a wannabe beauty queen's obsessional love, featuring a missionary, a kidnapping, a daring escape, a flight from justice, and a woman to some wronged, not least Joyce herself. To others she was a kind of contemporary witch, able to manipulate people, particularly men, to her own ends and change identity at will. I will let you decide how you want to see this woman after it is revealed the lengths she went to in order to be with the man she loved and was obsessed over. If it had been the other way around, if a man had done this to a woman, the public, the authorities and the media would have treated this case differently. Joyce McKenny was an only child born to parents that were both teachers. She grew up in Avery County, North Carolina, in a small town called Minneapolis. She was very bright and was known for her impeccable behaviour. In 1967 she graduated and went to East Tennessee State University and went on to get an MA from the University of North Carolina. In 1973 she became restless and, having converted to Mormonism, she moved to Provo in Utah. She stayed in the student accommodation called the Riviera, which was located just outside the university campus. These apartments were owned by the famous Osmond family. Joyce also had a strong religious appreciation of morality, including the vow of chastity, but as she came of age she would have a second guiding principle in her life, being a celebrity. These two did not mix well. In fact, they would end up clashing. While in Utah, she set about infiltrating the social circles around the Osmonds, the squeaky clean family pop group that were the pride of the Mormon church. It is said that she set her sights on one of the brothers, Wayne, but Olive Osmond, the matriarch of the family, was not having any of it, and she made sure to keep Joyce away from her boys. Later, when Wayne announced his engagement to someone else, Joyce was devastated. She also had a compulsive weakness for beauty pageants, which she frequently entered, seldom with success, although she was chosen as Miss Wyoming and competed in Miss USA in 1974. Not long after the Osmond disappointment, Joyce would meet a young man named Kirk Anderson, and the couple started dating. Kirk was described as a cross between Clark Kent and Gary Cooper, but he did not live up to the characteristics of either. In reality, he was a non-prepossessing figure, 6'5", overweight, ill at ease, and at 19 years of age, he was 6 years younger than Joyce. She would say she first saw Kirk as he got out of his car to go into the local ice cream parlour, as she sat in her bright orange Corvette. Kirk would say Joyce wasn't hard to miss sitting in her car, and so he went over and they started talking. They would only go on 2 dates before Joyce would confess her undying love for him, and Joyce would say after dating only a few weeks they were engaged. They were too old to go steady, according to Joyce, even though Kirk was only 19. Once they started dating, Joyce moved out of the student accommodation and rented a house. The landlady was an easygoing woman who let Joyce have a dog. She lost her virginity to Kirk on the waterbed she had purchased and placed in the lounge. When this happened, Kirk became overwhelmed with guilt and went on to confess his sinful behaviour to the Mormon elders, who promptly tried to put a stop to the affair by telling him to break up with Joyce, and he did. 2 days later, Kirk was riding his motorbike and not his car, as someone had slashed his tyres. Joyce came up behind him in her car and began to follow him, nearly driving him off the road several times, but he did manage to make it home in one piece. Joyce turned up eventually and screamed blue murder about Kirk going to a party with her that night. Soon after this, in August 1975, it was recommended that maybe Joyce check herself into a mental facility in Provo for arrest. Once there, Joyce climbed out of a window of the facility and escaped as she knew Kirk was being packed up and moved out of Utah on missionary work. Joyce would also say that she found herself pregnant not long after, but had a miscarriage. Appalled by the church's actions, Joyce turned her back on the Mormon church, but not on Kirk. She was madly in love with him and was about to do anything to be with him, as we will see. Before Kirk went to England, and why he ended up there was because Joyce pursued him across America, first to California and then to Oregon, where, in an effort to escape her attention, he lived under an assumed name. When she found him there, it was then that the only thing the church could do, in their eyes, to save Kirk from this wicked woman was to send him abroad, and so he ended up in England, first going to Grinstead, then Reading, and finally Epsom. This again did not deter Joyce, and so when she was living in California, she hired a detective agency to find Kirk. Also, she had met another man at this time by the name of Keith May, who was training to be a pilot, and he had advertised for flying companions, and Joyce had answered his ad. Of course, Joyce didn't waste any time in telling Keith about her long-lost love, the man she was engaged to and that was taken from her. Soon she would enlist Keith to help her. Keith, not so keen, told her to forget about Kirk and be with him instead. Her response to this was, "Why does everyone have to fall in love with me?" You see, Joyce had also met a man named Steve, and soon after she moved in with him and he fell in love with her. Even though she was living with Steve, she had to find a way of supporting herself, and so she would advertise in the LA Free Press newspaper, advertising herself for acting and modelling gigs, along with other services like erotic photography and phone calls, escort services and private messages. Joyce would advertise her services discreetly. She would always tell a client that sex was not on the table, that she was saving herself for her fiancé Kirk. In the end, Joyce would have to partner up with another girl, and this girl would have to fulfill the role that Joyce was not willing to do. She would make around $500 to $600 a week, and this was used to pay the detectives to find Kirk. The detectives managed to bug Kirk's family home, and when he phoned home, that is when she found out he was in England. Once Joyce had this information, she contacted a private detective in England to pinpoint exactly where Kirk was living. She sent him money by post along with a letter explaining why she was looking for him. She told him that they were engaged, that she was pregnant, and the church did not approve of their union, and so they had sent Kirk away. The detective traced Kirk to Reading, and in August 1977, it was then she placed an ad in a local newspaper, looking for two tall burly guys to go on an all-expenses-paid trip to Europe to help fulfill a honeymoon fantasy. Joyce received loads of responses to her ad, and eventually she settled on a couple of guys that went to the same gym as her. Their names was Shaw and Parker. On the 15th of September 1977, newspapers in the UK carried a story of a young 21-year-old American who had gone missing, and the police were appealing for help in tracing his last known movements. It was said that he had gone missing from outside his church on Banstead Road in the Epsom area southwest of London. He was seen talking to a man named Bob Bosler. This man had contacted the church days earlier, expressing his interest in becoming a member of the Mormon church, and so it was arranged that he would meet Kirk on the 14th for a chat. That evening, when Kirk didn't return home, his roommate reported him missing. At this stage, Kirk had been in England 10 months, and his fellow members were all too aware of the hardships he had left behind in America, concerning a young woman he had been associated with. His friends told police of the harassment he had endured, how he had tires slashed, windows broke, nearly run off the road when on his motorbike, and ran out of the country in order to get away from this woman. The name they gave was, of course, Joyce McKenny. Joyce and Keith May, along with their two new companions, Shaw and Parker, arrived in Heathrow, London on the 5th of August 1977. One of the men, Parker, got a grilling going through customs and was getting cold feet, and so booked a flight back to LA for the next day. The other man, Shaw, contacted a guy he knew, Alan Austin, who put him in touch with two more men, Dennis and Kenny, who were what we call fixers. These guys thought the Americans were a bit odd, but when they brought Joyce to the bank to exchange her money, they knew that whatever their story was, there was money to be made. They found a car and a holiday rental for Joyce to stay in at a cost of £50 a week. It was a little cottage in Oakhampton on the northern edge of Dartmoor. Joyce wanted a place with bars on the windows, but had to settle with reinforced bulletproof plexiglass, which the hired men fitted. Keith May was brought to a hardware store to buy padlocks, chains and ropes. With these purchases and things getting more bizarre when it came to the Americans, the men were questioning their part in what they thought to be a rescue mission. Joyce had convinced the men that Kirk was in a cult and that they were there to get him out. When they saw Joyce, Keith and Shaw with a gun, chloroform, microphones and listening devices, to them this was a step too far, and the three men, Alan, Dennis and Kenny, decided to step away from this whole crazy idea. This left Joyce, Keith and Shaw to fend for themselves and get the job done. On discovering the men gone, Shaw too wanted out, telling Joyce he was going to see some friends and never returning. Being only Joyce and Keith left now, Joyce was furious that her plan to kidnap Kirk was falling apart. She went on to report Alan to police for stealing her money. When police questioned him, he told them of their plans to rescue a young Mormon man, the fiancé of Joyce. He also told police that both Joyce and Keith had used false passports to get into the country. Police asked him why he had not reported all this to them before. Alan replied that he thought it was so far-fetched that he wouldn't be believed. A few days later, when he heard that a young American had disappeared, he went back to police once more, telling them that Joyce and Keith must be the kidnappers based on what he knew. The police took this serious and went in search of Joyce and Keith. Kirk had been kidnapped on the evening of the 14th of September and held for 3 days. The guy Bob, who had been seen with Kirk outside the church that evening, was in fact Keith, and it was he that brought him at gunpoint to an awaiting car with Joyce in the driver's seat. They then drove him to the little cottage, drugged him and shackled him to a bed. Exactly what took place in the cottage during the following 3 days remains the subject of dispute, but all parties agree that at one stage, while Kirk was tied to a bed, Joyce repeatedly had sex with him in an effort to become pregnant. Joyce would maintain that the reason Kirk was tied up was to ease Kirk's guilt about sexual enjoyment. Kirk would say different. He would say he was raped. On the 17th of September 1977, after 3 days, Kirk was found by police and interviewed. When police spoke with Kirk, he told them that he had been kidnapped, held against his will and raped by a wealthy woman who was obsessed with him. On the 19th of September, 2 days later, Joyce and Keith were arrested after being stopped at a roadblock. When the car was examined, it had 2 fake guns inside, a bottle of chloroform and a box of lingerie. The cottage that they had rented was also searched, and shackles were found along with handcuffs and leg irons. With growing media interest, the police had to finally make a statement about what had happened, telling reporters that there was a sexual element to the kidnapping. The chief superintendent told the group of reporters off the record, "All I can say is we found certain equipment, and I can tell you what, I've never been lucky enough to have anything like that happen to me," he said. Joyce and Keith were held on remand for a total of 3 months in Holloway Prison, after being charged with unlawful imprisonment, abduction and possession of fake guns with intent to commit a criminal offence. And she would get her chance when committal proceedings began to decide if a trial would take place or not. She held up a sign for the waiting press stating, "Kirk left with me willingly. He fears excommunication for leaving his mission and made up this kidnap rape story. I am innocent, please help me." In the court, she demanded that reporting restrictions be lifted and then spoke at length to the court about how much she loved Kirk and demanded to know where he was. She spoke about such matters as the erotic benefits of oral gratification, as reporters feverishly scribbled her every word, unable to believe the gift of ready-to-print gold for their newspaper. As far as the press were concerned, Joyce was turning into the Scarlett O'Hara of sexual liberation. If Joyce was never quite the fabulous beauty of her imagination, the press changed that for her. She was blonde, shapely, with a sweet face, and most beguiling of all, she had a lovely southern accent. As she spoke in court, she may have won the press over for all the wrong reasons, but not the prosecution. They argued that Joyce was a stalker whose all-consuming passion had led her to abduct Kirk and force him to have sex. The barrister for the Crown read out Kirk's submission. I was taken from outside my church at gunpoint by a man named Bob, who was in fact Keith May. He brought me to his car, and inside the car Joyce was waiting. Once all three were in the car, they drove at speed to the cottage. When they got there, Joyce cooked dinner and explained to Kirk that he was taken so they could talk and sort out their problems. She confessed her love for him and told him she wanted to marry him. On that first night, Joyce spent it in the same room as Kirk. Nothing physical happened. Joyce just talked and talked and talked. The next morning, Keith entered the room with a leather cuff and chain, which he attached to Kirk and then the bed. Kirk didn't know where he was and didn't know what to do, so he thought his best bet was to cooperate with his captors. He had been promised that if he made Joyce pregnant, they would let him go. The second night, Joyce again spent the night with Kirk. This time Kirk kissed and held Joyce, hoping that this would convince her that he was cooperating and that she would let him go. On the third night, Joyce entered the room, wearing a negligee. She lay down next to him on the bed and Kirk asked her for a back rub. But Joyce had other ideas and tried her best to entice Kirk to make love to her. But he wasn't having any of it. Joyce, not happy, jumped out of the bed and left the room, returning a while later with Keith May in tow. He had a bag with him, and in this bag was the chains, ropes and padlocks. It was at this point Kirk was tied to the bedpost by both arms and legs. After that, Kirk told the court how Joyce grabbed his pyjamas from just around his neck and tore them from his body. She then ripped off his religious undergarments and performed on him orally, and then intercourse occurred. He said, the chains were tight and I could not move. She proceeded to have intercourse. I did not want it to happen. I was very upset. Afterwards, with Kirk now less shackled, he picked up Joyce and flung her across the bed, with her telling him she didn't care and that she would keep him there until she got what she wanted. Kirk said he promised Joyce he'd marry her and that they had sex a total of 3 times, and each time it was forced upon him. The defence would argue that it was a type of bondage and Kirk had been a willing participant. They also mentioned that Kirk and Joyce had taken a trip to London together, and Kirk said he had not attempted to escape because at this stage they were returning him to Epsom, where he was taken from. A letter to Kirk from Joyce's lawyers from 2 years earlier was also read to the court. It stated that Joyce was pregnant. He was the father and they needed to get married. If he did not do so, she would sue him. Kirk told the court that he believed that Joyce was never pregnant, as it was only 3 days after they first slept together that she told him that she was pregnant. The hearing went on for several weeks and Joyce got to speak more than once, and every time she opened her mouth it was like fodder for the newspapers. At first she portrayed herself to be a young innocent girl who moved to Utah and joined the Mormons. How doing this saved her from a world of sin, and the girls she knew in university had loose morals, and that is why she had moved out of the student accommodation to a place of her own. This is when she met Kirk, a fellow Mormon, and fell in love with him. She said she would never have given herself to him without promises being in place, that she was not that type of girl. On the other hand, Joyce had no problem talking about sex, and she went into so much detail that she could have written the part 2 of The Joy of Sex, said one reporter. She would explain the psychology of sexual submission and bondage, how Kirk had sexual hang-ups because he was raised by a very dominant mother, which was not ever proven. Joyce would say that Kirk had a lot of guilt about sex because his mother was overprotective all his life, and that he had to be tied up to have an orgasm. But what really put the cherry on top for the press was when Joyce declared her feelings for Kirk by saying, "I loved Kirk so much that I would have skied down Mount Everest in the nude with the carnation up my nose." It was like Joyce knew exactly what to say to get noticed by the press. It's as if she had studied the tabloid newspapers while incarcerated. Sure, what else had she to be doing? At the end of the hearing, the magistrate sent the case for trial for May 1978. He also granted bail to both Joyce and Keith. The public thought it was a waste of money. After all, they said, how can a woman rape a man? It was deemed laughable. Joyce wasn't charged with actual rape of a man, as it was not a criminal offence in 70s Britain, and the notion that Kirk found the whole ordeal as unpleasant was met with suspicion. After all, a man never not enjoyed sex, was the attitude. Joyce's parents had come to England to support her, and so she was ordered to stay with them along with Keith May. With her newfound fame, she, along with Keith, toured Fleet Street offices looking to sell her story for £50,000. She promised to expose the Mormon Church and the Osmond family, and took out an ad in Variety seeking the attention of agents and film studios. Her sharp routine in and out of court didn't go unnoticed. If she was capable of such show-stealing turns, news editors began to wonder, could her story of a sheltered life really make sense? And what had she been up to in the 2 years between leaving Utah and coming to England? At the time, the Daily Mirror newspaper had one of their reporters over in LA, hoping to get an exclusive with George Best, a famous Manchester United football player who had moved there. This reporter could not gain access to George, and so when he got a tip-off about a man named Steve, who was an ex-boyfriend of Joyce McKenny, he decided to go in that direction instead for a story. The reporter set out to find Steve and the truth about who Joyce really was. When the reporter got in contact with Steve, he turned up at his hotel the next day with a stash of photographs featuring Joyce in various nude poses. Steve also told the reporter that Joyce had worked as an escort. The reporter set about collecting all he could on Joyce, and 3 weeks later he returned to London with a bulging file of lurid evidence. The only problem was the Mirror newspaper couldn't run the story. Anything published before the trial would be contempt of court, and at this time, April 1978, it looked like the trial was being indefinitely postponed. When Joyce was doing the London rounds, she was invited to the premiere of Joan Collins's new movie, The Stud, and you could safely say Joyce upstaged Joan Collins, which is a hard thing to do even today. Joyce enjoyed every minute of the attention she got from the photographers and reporters. Posing this way and that way, people recognised her as a performer, someone who slipped into her role. She became the act and the act became her. A few days after the movie premiere, Joyce would put her acting ability into play once more. As part of her bail terms, she was to sign in every day at her local police station, but on this particular day she failed to do so. You see, with the help of her landlady, who she had managed to charm to her cause, Joyce, along with Keith, assumed the identities of 2 dead Mormons, got fake passports made, and slipped out of the country in disguise, pretending to be 2 deaf mutes. They first went to Ireland, and from there they flew to Canada, and then made their way back into the United States from there. Once back in the States, Joyce contacted the editor of the Daily Express and told him that she wanted to sell her story exclusively to them for £40,000, which the editor agreed to. The reporter, with a suitcase full of money, flew out to Atlanta and met with Joyce at the Hilton Hotel near the airport. The reporter travelled from state to state following Joyce and Keith, who were trying to stay ahead of the FBI, who they feared were tracking them. The story Joyce gave to the Daily Express was in stark contrast with the story the Daily Mirror was about to publish. She gave the impression to the Daily Express that she was nothing short of a misunderstood, sweet country girl who got caught up in the business in London, and everything was part of a Mormon conspiracy. With Joyce and Keith having absconded, it looked increasingly unlikely that the trial was going to take place. So both the Daily Mirror and the Daily Express decided to go to print in the hope they would not be charged with contempt of court. Their gamble paid off. Once Joyce was back in America, neither the police nor the judiciary were keen to have her back in England or the dock, hoping that she would fade into history. On Monday, the 22nd of May 1978, the Daily Express published the Joyce McKenny story under the headline My Undying Love. She was photographed in a roll-neck sweater, smiling with a carnation in her teeth, describing her love for Kirk as tender, profound and indestructible. The Daily Mirror published the very same day, and the photograph used was of Joyce naked and staring at the camera with a less than innocent expression. The headline was The Real McKenny. It read, she called herself Little Miss Perfect, but there was another side to the runaway beauty queen, Joyce McKenny. Soon word got back to Joyce about the Daily Mirror story, and she became hysterical, so much so that the people she was with thought she was going to throw herself off the balcony. Joyce had to be taken to the hospital and sedated. She was released later that night and she returned to her hotel. Her parents were called, and when they arrived the next morning and the sedatives had worn off, Joyce went into another meltdown, going so far that she bit her poor dad on the arm. There was such a commotion at the hotel that 2 state troopers turned up. Once what was going on was explained to the troopers, they both scratched their heads, baffled as to what to do with Joyce. So they did nothing. They just left her in the care of her parents. Joyce nor Keith were ever extradited back to England. Instead, they were sentenced in absentia and were given 1 year probation for skipping bail. In July 1979, Joyce and Keith were both arrested by the FBI for travelling on fake passports. They were both given suspended sentences. When Kirk returned to America, he would get a job in real estate, get married and have 3 children. But our Joyce had not gone away fully. She would still try to see him. In 1984, Joyce was arrested at Salt Lake City Airport, where Kirk worked by then as a travel agent. In her car was a set of handcuffs, some rope and a notebook detailing Kirk's movements. Joyce did not turn up for her court hearing and her case was dismissed. She would never marry and would continuously tell anyone that was willing to listen that Kirk and her was the greatest love story ever told, and dismissed the Daily Mirror's report on her as malicious fabrication. Joyce became an advocate for animal rights and involved in the Right to Life movement. In 2008, she became the first owner of cloned puppies, where DNA was taken from one of her beloved dead dogs named Booger. She had paid a Korean lab $50,000 to clone the dog. A documentary film, Tabloid, would be released in 2010 about the kidnapping of Kirk Anderson and the life of Joyce McKenny. Joyce participated in the making of the film by giving numerous interviews. When it was released, Joyce was not a happy bunny. It did not paint her in the light she thought it would. She would go on to sue the director, claiming that the film had defamed her, violated her likeness, and the director had misrepresented the project to get her on board by telling her it would clear her name, but instead it made her out to be a prostitute and a crazy person, she said. The case would be dismissed. But Joyce did not leave it there. She would travel from state to state and protest wherever the film was being shown. During the showings, she would sit among the audience, and when the film was over, she would stand up and scream, "I am Joyce McKenny." A book by Anthony Delano was also written. In 2019, Joyce was homeless and living in her vehicle with her 3 dogs when she was charged with the hit-and-run manslaughter of a 91-year-old pedestrian. The court found Joyce mentally incompetent and sent her for psychiatric treatment, confirming in 2020 that she would remain in a psychiatric hospital with ongoing assessments with the intent on releasing her eventually. To this day, she still has not been released. With regards to the Kirk Anderson case, the legal proceedings of this case were marked by controversy and public interest, with the case raising questions about consent, coercion, and the reliability of testimony in emotionally charged relationships. It also gives us insight into the psychology of obsession and the dynamics of control in relationships. The reporter that spent weeks with Joyce after she escaped back to America described her as just a bit crazy, eccentric, self-obsessed, self-involved and manipulative, and barking mad probably. I think this case shows the double standards of how men are treated in comparison to women back then and in today's society. If it had been a man that did this to a woman, he would have had the book thrown at him and served time. He would not have just served 3 months on remand, released on bail, invited to film premieres, paid vast amounts of money for his story, escaped justice, and not extradited back to face what they had done. This woman stalked, kidnapped, held a man hostage for 3 days, molested him and raped him, and tried to get herself pregnant, all in the name of love. Well, if that is love, no wonder so many men are stepping back now and living the MGTOW life. I have come across many comments about this woman, and a vast majority, mainly women, are still making excuses for her and romanticising what she did and using the defence that the Mormon church set her up. I have also seen posts where men are saying, "Lucky fella," or "I wouldn't mind that happening to me," which is equally wrong. I personally don't think the church had a hand in Joyce going off the rails and keeping her from Kirk. Of course they have their rules and beliefs, as many churches do, and I do know chastity is a big thing for them. Kirk's beliefs aside, in my opinion, he was the victim here and he should be recognised. The justice system failed him in many ways, and he never got justice, just humiliation. I'm glad he got to move on with his life and had a family. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to check out my main channel, Irish Coffee True Crime.